panel. All right, great. So our final speaker is Dr. Roger Glass, who is going to use slides or not going to use slides so we can have the fire still. Okay, great. So Dr. Glass also needs no introduction. He's the director of the Fogarty International Center at NIH, and before that had a 3-decade career at CDC studying gastroenteritis. And he probably doesn't remember this, but when I was a first-year medical student, it was the first week, and he came over from CDC to Emory, where I was, and gave a talk on his work in rotavirus and field sites around the world. And I thought, oh, I would really like to do that. And a couple of years later, I became a Fogarty Fellow and ended up starting my own global health career experience. So you never know when one of these talks is really going to impact a young person in the audience. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jessica. Peter, that was a wonderful story. I mean, and how many of you know about Fogarty? Raise your hands. Wow, this is terrific. I think the joy of my job is to go around the world and have people come up to me who I've never met before and tell me they were Fogarty Fellows. I have a totally different story. I never got that October phone call from Sweden, but I did do my PhD in Sweden, and I did fail a lot. And I think one of the greatest encouragements to my children is the fact that I failed courses throughout high school and college and medical school and the like. And when I failed the first part of the medical exams, I was really embarrassed. I missed by 1 point. But when my daughter went to take the exam, I said, Nina, you'll have to do better than me because I didn't do so well. So I think failing really is really part of growing up. And my career has been scattered by opportunities from disaster. I started out throughout college with a love of traveling. I went to Russia after medical school and spent 7 months in a Russian laboratory, and it was an eye-opener, and it's kept me interested in Russia for a long time. I had a Fulbright after college to Argentina and Brazil. It was my way of getting away from the draft and the Vietnam War for a year. And it got me to learn Spanish and French and see how people around the world think. So it was finally, and I got married to a woman who's a pediatrician. She's still with me despite my idiosyncrasies. And I dragged her off to Bangladesh. Her chief of pediatrics said, you're losing a really good job to go off to Bangladesh. What's going to become of you? And she's had an extraordinary career despite that. And they look back at her and say, gosh, that was the key point change in your career. You did something, stepped out to do something totally different. Why does somebody get interested in diarrheal diseases? It's something that you can't tell your kids don't want their friends to have you talk about. And I got in it through a not very direct way. I was at CDC working in environmental health. My wife and I decided after her fellowship that we were going to go someplace overseas. We didn't want to go work on Lassa fever because if we got sick, there's no treatment. So we decided to go to Bangladesh, of all places, a sight unseen. And but before I did that, I didn't know anything about enteric diseases. So the CDC group plopped me on a cruise ship, one of those big cruise ships. I went out for a day. This cruise ship had 3,000 people, 800 of them had diarrhea. And I went on Saturday morning as it came into the port. And within an hour, I knew that there were 800 people who were sick as hell. The president of the company said, "Oh, we can clean this up overnight and ship them out tomorrow." And it was to me to close down the ship or to do the investigation. And it was really exciting, and I could use my Spanish to find out that everybody who had been taken off the ship had salmonella of a single strain. It was probably totally illegal at the time to get privileged information from a hospital lab, but My Spanish was good enough to get through the junior microbiologist who gave me all the data. And it was really satisfying, but I thought this is not how I want to change the world. Rich people on cruise ships in the Caribbean. So I ended up going to Bangladesh, where I lived on a barge in the Ganges 3 days a week for 4 years. And it was absolutely delightful. There were, the crows would eat my food from my dinner plate, but I learned so much about people. I ended up later in life having back problems, and I realized that my field supervisor was Muslim. It's the second largest Muslim country in the world. He prayed 5 times a day. And if I had prayed 5 times a day, I probably wouldn't have had back problems. And it makes you think about cultures that are important for health. I also was there at a time when women had 6.5 kids and family planning was going nowhere. And it was just impossible. $500 million in family planning went nowhere. And then as I went back year after year, by about 1985, and women would stay home after menarche, and they get married at 13 or 14 years of age. When I went back in 85 and periodically, women entered the workforce. They started microfinance. They had jobs. They had value. And all of a sudden, family planning was incredibly successful, and women had 2.5 kids instead of 6.5, and they had jobs, and they had value. And I saw that public health solutions weren't always important. It was the total opportunities and the like. So I learned so many things from that international experience, to the point where at Fogarty, we've sent over 1,000 young people, just like me, abroad for a year of mentored research. And I think it's about the most valuable experience you can have in your careers. To get out there, to get your feet wet, to see how people view things differently, to know that you have lots of skills and you still have a lot to learn. And that really has been the attraction of me for global health. Well, I got out to Bangladesh. I don't want to be long, but I was sent out. I was asked if I wanted to work in Bangladesh to run a cholera vaccine trial. This was in 1979. And I said, sure. Now, I'd never seen a case of cholera. I never run a vaccine trial. I didn't know how to run a vaccine trial, but I said, I'm your guy. And when I got there, after 3 months of getting oriented and whatever, NIH decided they weren't going to do the trial anymore. And I was in the field without an activity. And with my wife set up surveillance for 100,000 children a year with diarrhea who came into this center. And I realized that rotavirus was the #1 cause of diarrhea, much more important than cholera, although cholera is terribly important. And also that diarrhea was the #1 cause of death in that population. And to deal with diarrheal illnesses at a time when there were 4 million deaths in the world was something that you could really take hold of, and was a thinking big. It was a big time problem. And that's been my career ever since. I came back and I worked at NIH. I did a PhD in microbiology. But over a period of about 20 years, we trained a whole generation of people around the world to do epidemiology of rotavirus globally, put the data on the web, laboratory studies. The biggest disappointment of my life was when, having worked at NIH with a wonderful mentor in Al Kapikian, the rotavirus vaccine, the first vaccine, was withdrawn for intussusception. And it was a real hair-raising experience, having seen at 25 years of vaccine come in and be licensed in the United States, only to be swept away. And I lost a lot of hair at that time, and trying to figure out what happened. But it led me, and we had gotten Gates money. I met Bill Gates, and he made a presentation in 1998, and it was that presentation that got him engaged in rotavirus and other vaccines at the very beginning. And a year later, I had to go back to him and say that the vaccine that we were going to be providing to the world for this global program was no more. How could I do that? And how do you deal with disaster? And I had to talk to the committee and pitch for rotavirus when I had nothing to pitch. It's a bit difficult. And I sat there, and Phil Russell was there, and he said, whatever you say, Roger, I'm going to stand up with you. And I said, but Phil, what am I going to do? And he said, well, it happens. Disasters happen all the time. This is where you learn from a good mentor. He said, in the military, disasters happen all the time. You send a group out, they get clobbered, and you just go into the commanding officer and you say, sir, a disaster happened. We never anticipated it, but we've been investigating what's going on, and we've learned what the problem was, and now we're going to get to our goal faster than before. I went into the committee, Gus Nossel and all these heavy hitters, young guy, and I said, gentlemen, ladies, we've had a disaster. We never could have anticipated the interception before. But in thinking about this overnight in bed, I said, we've realized that first we only had one manufacturer making this vaccine. They were never in a position or thought about scaling up, so they were never going to go anywhere. And they scared away the other manufacturers, GSK and Merck. And now that they're out of it, the others can compete and we'll have more. So second, we created a global demand for rotavirus vaccine. And now all the countries would like to have this vaccine. They're ready. I said, third, emerging manufacturers have learned that this vaccine is just a little virus in liquid. It's like polio vaccine. It's very simple, and it should be cheap as hell, and it should not be costly. And so I said, I think we're going to get to our goal faster than we ever expected. They said, full steam ahead. And from that, we've had further disasters in the difficulty that the vaccine is only about half effective. But even that could stop mortality that's substantial in the developing world. For the cost issue, I was so upset by the cost of the vaccines. In the U.S., it's $200 a child for something that should cost $1. So we worked in India for 20 years to make a vaccine for $1 a dose. And it was an unusual commitment. People say it takes $800 million to make a new vaccine. We were able to do this for under $100 million, under $80 million, with support from the government of India and the Gates Foundation. So it was really a tremendous thrill for me when the Prime Minister of India, Modi, came in, and 6 weeks after he became the Prime Minister, he said that every child in India would get a rotavirus vaccine. And today, about half those children are getting rotavirus vaccine. Now, when I started this, I started without any knowledge of vaccinology whatsoever. The company we worked with had no experience in making a vaccine, but through networking and together, really accomplished amazing things through lots of difficulties. The lessons, a number of lessons. Failure is an important part of learning, and you can't miss an opportunity from disaster to learn and to do something better, to think differently. Second, you have to take science where the problems are. And I think my motivation through life has been to think about the developing world. And I think in the Fogarty programs that we run, the ability to take young Americans like you people and put you in a research environment in the developing world to attack some major problems is one of the most wonderful things we can do, because your careers will extend over the next 30 or 40 years, and that lesson and those practices will stay with you. And for the foreign investigators, the same, to be able to work in an international context with American investigators will really stimulate you. Follow your passions. I never thought that diarrhea would be a passion. And my kids accept that now. I think mentors can be absolutely critical. It's been stated, it cannot be understated or overstated, because your ability to publish and get recognition and to know where the opportunities are and where to change your field are important. Life-family balance. I'm married to a wife who is a chair of pediatrics and is a dean, and a daughter who's a trauma surgeon, two areas that women never went into when I was a medical student. So work-life balance are incredibly important to happiness in your life, and you can always step back You'll never look back and regret that you didn't spend more time with your family. There's a lot more to say, but let's really open it up for questions. I'm delighted. This is my first chat, so I don't know if I'm a chatty type. I see Jim LeDuc there, who was my mentor at CDC when I was there, and I'm looking at Gail Castle, who was on my board at Fogarty, and many other Fogarty fellows who really energized me. So thanks so much for the opportunity to chat with you.